How we understand God is through the revelation of his names, his titles, and his attributes. And so what Jesus did is he gives all these to us. And this is a summary. If you take all those attributes that I showed you last time and just look at some of them, starting in Matthew, look at Matthew 5 and verse 45, where Jesus says this, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He makes his sun rise. His. God owns the sun. Properties. God says, you want to know what a trophy property is? I own the sun. Can anybody else claim that? And I make my sun, S-U-N, rise on the just and the unjust. What Jesus is saying is, the Father I'm introducing you to rules, he owns, he created, he controls the universe. And he is all-powerful, or as we know it, omnipotent. But it means all-powerful. So Jesus says, I want to introduce you to my Father. And I want you to, my Father has his hand extended to you. And if you choose, you can reach up and connect with him and say, Father, the one who's in heaven, the one who rules the whole universe, this is what I need to share with you. But when you connect with him, it changes everything about how we share. Why? Because he understands everything. He feels our needs. He is not like a high priest who can't understand our needs, as the book of Hebrews says, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Jesus understands humanness. He feels, what is the most frequent emotion of Christ in the Gospels, the 89 chapters? Compassion. What does compassion mean? Sympatheo, sympathy, means you feel with someone. Actually, compassion, the word Jesus uses, is the word, it's a visceral word. It means you can feel. He felt inside our pains. He feels our needs, and he gives to us. Those are understanding, feeling, and giving is all an expression of his love. God is always loving, which means as we come and approach him, your Father already understands what you're coming about, but he wants you to share. He already feels what you're going through, but he still wants you to tell him. And he wants to give, look what it says here, good. Look at chapter 7, verse 11. I mean, all these are predicated on what Jesus revealed. And he says, if you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? He's the Father, we're the children, he gives good things. But we're supposed to ask. So that's what prayer is about. How much of your day do you want to go through without asking and staying connected to God? It's very interesting. The more you understand the connection between prayer, understanding life, and knowing God's will. It's all interconnected, unbelievably, by Jesus. And then he said, this same Father sees everything. Look at Matthew 6:4. And you remember we went over these last week. In Matthew 6:4, the Lord says this, your charitable deed be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret. He sees what is being done, and that's a reflection of his all-knowingness, his omniscience. There are two attributes here, omniscience, omniscio, all-knowing, and also this is actually his wisdom. You talk about someone that makes great decisions. Someone who sees everything, knows everything, forgets nothing, knows everything equally vividly, is a great person to ask advice from. I mean, they already know what's going to happen, and they even know how we fit in the intricacy of what God's parameters, because God allows us to make choices within his will. And we can, I mean, it's very interesting, if this is God's will for us, and this is what he wants, he has in there the avenue that we can choose to stay in that he rewards, And over here, we can bump along in here in all this disobedience. He still has the guardrails. He doesn't let us go beyond his will, but he has for us the time we walk holding his hand and the time we pull our hand away and do our own thing. And this part of our life, it says in 1 Corinthians 3, will be burned up. Because God says, you chose to live that not connected to me, not holding on to me, going your own way, pulling your hand out of mine, saying you can make it on your own. I'll burn all that up, but I'll reward you for everything that we do, acknowledging his wisdom and omniscience and saying, I need you. And finally, he's everywhere present. Look at 6:8. I love this one. It says, therefore don't be like them, for your Father knows what you have need of before you ask him. I mean, you talk about the God who is walking through life, seeing where we are. He knows everything about us and what we need before we ask him, because he's right here watching. He knows we're weary. He knows we're troubled. He knows we're... And look at verse 18, a little bit later, further down. It says, and don't appear to men to be fasting, but your Father who is in the secret place, 6:18 says. Your Father is already there. I mean, he's watching. And he's not just watching through binoculars, he's watching right there. You know, it reminds me of, I shouldn't tell you this, but a dear friend of mine lives in Oregon. Bonnie and I spent a lot of time with him, and he was very successful in his career. And he bought his wife a BMW like 629B or I or Q or something, you know, one of the really sleek ones. And he bought her the very finest radar detectors. I mean, the kind that cost hundreds, not just a simple one. And it's, you know, cloaked. You can't even see it, so they can't tell you have one. And she would go visit her mother in the nursing home, and it was 100 miles, and she could make it in an hour. I mean, she actually drove 100 miles an hour the entire way down the highway. And Sally was a good friend of mine. I wouldn't want to ride with her, but, you know. And one day, she got pulled over, and rolled her window down and looked up at the policeman and said, could I just ask you a question? She said, my husband bought me the very finest radar detector. How on earth did you catch me? He said, well, you passed me, ma'am. You see, that's what we have to realize, that God is there. You can't do anything. He's watching, and he sees us when we pass him because he's always present.